Welcome to this Ivey Impact live session, Beyond the Ballot, from Promise to Policy. I'm Julian Birkinshaw, Dean of the Ivey Business School, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. Canada's 45th federal election has ushered in a moment of both opportunity and uncertainty. For the first time in history, both leading parties secured over 40% of the vote, yet neither holds a majority. The result? A minority government navigating serious headwinds, affordability pressures, strained relations with the US, and a sluggish economy. At the same time, business leaders are sounding the alarm, citing declining investment, productivity challenges, and competitiveness hurdles. Today, we'll unpack what this new political reality means for economic policy, business confidence, and Canada's future. Most importantly, we'll explore how campaign promises can evolve into pragmatic policy. Joining me to do this are three of Canada's most respected public and private sector leaders. Importantly, all proud graduates of Western University. Stephen Poloz, former Governor of the Bank of Canada and Chair of the Lawrence National Centre for Policy and Management. Janet Ecker, former Ontario Minister of Finance and Senior Fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute. And Bill Morneau, former Federal Minister of Finance and current Director at CIBC and Chair of NovaSource Power Services. We've received several great questions in advance and welcome more through the Q&A function. The session's being recorded and will be available on the Ivey Impact site. So let's get started. Quick responses to the news that has been gathering over the last few days about both how global economic relations, US-China, for example, in the news overnight, but also how the Canadian policies are starting to kind of take shape in the wake of Mark Carney being elected. Janet, let's go to you first. Any quick thoughts on what's been going on in the last couple of days?
Well, two things. I think Prime Minister Carney gets a gold star for his performance in the White House. That must have been tough, him trying to hold his tongue, but he didn't get Zelensky'd, and I think planted a couple of really good messages. But we'll see. I mean, there was no big win there, but there certainly was potential for big loss. So, but the other thing is that, as the StatsCan numbers indicate, the tariffs are starting to bite. So this is going to get ugly.
Yeah, Bill, what do you reckon?
Well, I agree with Janet. This was a good start, but I think we need to recognize that we are maybe not even in the first inning of this discussion from a Canadian perspective. So the volatility and the uncertainty that businesses are facing and that Canadians are facing, is likely to be continuing for a period of time. The goal of the government is to make that period of time shorter as best we possibly can in the face of a pretty unclear set of objectives from our neighbor to the south, and do that in a way that helps businesses to get closer to being able to plan. So far so good, but lots more to do.
But lots to do. Steve, what are your initial thoughts about what's been going on the last couple of days?
Well, I think what we're coming to is that maybe the president has in mind 10% all along. So that a lot of posturing, you would have expected that from him for sure. Of course, I never would have dreamed that we would begin at 50% or 100% or any of these kinds of things. But we need to understand that 10% is still a huge number, a very disruptive number, and not let our relief carry us away. That's going to terrifically restructure the economy.
Give us a sense of the historical number that we would have been living with in the last 5-10 years.
Well, if you look at when Trump first said he was going to do reciprocal tariffs, it's pretty easy to look up how much of a tariff other countries charge the United States. It's on the WTO website, and it's more like 3% or perhaps 4%. And that's kind of an average weighted across various categories. And so the whole idea of reciprocal was nonsense from the Rose Garden that day, in that magnitude sense.
Right. So even if it's a modest trade war, it's still bad for every economy. I mean, as we know, there's no winners in trade wars, right?
No, sir.
Indeed. So we've got a bunch of meaty topics we want to get into, and we're going to start with trade relations. Bill, I'm going to turn to you first on this, because you, as I gather, were actually responsible for leading Canada's discussions, negotiations with Bill Morneau, who was, of course, working with Trump first time round. So give us a little bit of an insight into how that worked out, as much as you prepared to reveal about the challenges of dealing with a slightly kind of schizophrenic set of actors south of the border, and what that means for next time round.
Well, I think most people do want to look back at history and hopefully see some parallels. We obviously have some differences. We recognize that the Trump administration #2 is not the same as #1. There were folks like Stephen Mnuchin, who was my interlocutor, and others in the first Trump administration that were, I think, relatively good at taming some of the wilder impulses of the administration. But that said, I think we could look to history and say that there's some things that we really need to be looking out for. First of all, and similar to last go round, it's really important to try and figure out what the administration really wants as we enter into a negotiation. And important to try to get to agreement on those issues quickly. So if I look back, we had steel and aluminum tariffs put on us in 2018. And what quickly became clear to me and to Stephen Mnuchin when we sat down to figure this out is that, in fact, the real worry was China, not Canada. They were worried about transshipment of steel through Canada to go to the United States. So getting to what the core issue is really important. And then hopefully moving to an answer as quickly as possible. I will say the challenge is that the devil is in the details. The last go round, while Stephen and I got to an agreement pretty quickly on what the challenge was, it still took 12 months for us to get these steel and aluminum tariffs and our reciprocal tariffs taken off. So the goal for the Carney government now will be to not only getting to understand where we're at, but to getting to conclusion and move as quickly as possible to get to a level of certainty against, what is almost certainly going to be a new normal. As Stephen says, the new normal is not going to be as good probably as the last normal, but getting there is very helpful if we can get there quickly and obviously put ourselves in the best possible position.
I mean, one thing the Trump government definitely wants is car factories to move from Canada to America, right? I mean, he's pretty explicit on that for reasons we all understand. I mean, how do we, Canada, respond to that? Because we're pretty clear that we want to leave these factories in Southwest Ontario, right?
Well, if you're thinking about that, obviously those companies have a long time horizon as they think about dealing with their supply chains. So again, I come back to the need to get to certainty quickly. I think what those organizations will tell the Trump administration and the Canadian government is the advantage of our current system. Our goal is to be inside the tent. That is clearly the #1 goal of Canada. And I think to the extent that business and government can work together, it will be clear that those current supply chains are adding value. And there will be changes for sure, but hopefully in that sector, as a good example, those changes will be relatively modest.
Got it. I'll go to Janet next, if that's okay. Obviously, you're speaking, as it were, for the provincial point of view. I mean, not just exclusively, but as we get into these negotiations, help us understand how the federal versus the provincial kind of agendas get played out.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good question. And I think that so far we're starting out, I think, relatively positively. I mean, the premier seemed to be wanting to work together on this. Doug Ford, Premier Ford, is sort of doing the Captain Canada thing, and it seems to be in certain way certainly working. But that will be a challenge because what the Prime Minister is going to need to do is put some things on the table that are going to be sacred cows in a province here or a province there. And that's where this thing always falls apart. We've been talking about interprovincial trade barriers since the 1980s. And, we're still talking about them. And I think I've said before, if we actually make progress on this file this time in my lifetime, I think we should send Trump a thank you note. Because the only thing that's knocking heads here, because and you said, Julian, about the things we can control and whatever. There are things we can control. We can control what happens here in terms of regulation and tax policy and all of this stuff. And we were an accident waiting to happen. If it wasn't Trump, it was going to be something else. Productivity, immigration, border security, our military. Like the list of to-dos in this country is incredibly long. And Trump has only, I think, just raised them to the surface and hopefully provided enough of an incentive to actually get over some of these hurdles, because a lot of good people have tried to solve interprovincial trade barriers and that kind of thing. And that's something I think we really do need to get done while we're trying to figure out what to do with the U.S. free trade agreement.
So, Steve, what's your view on that? I mean, even for me as a relative newcomer to Canada, I hear about interprovincial trade barriers as being something we've been trying to fix forever. I mean, help us. I mean, are we deluding ourselves that this time it's different and we're finally going to crack it?
Well, I'd like to think Janet's right. If this event gives us the momentum that we need to make some hard decisions, that would be wonderful. I've been harping on this my whole time as an economist, which is a long time. And when the rubber hits the road, though, we get but we can't do that. So, you know, we were talking about perhaps 4% of Canada's GDP lying on the sidewalk, and provincial leaders simply won't bend down to pick it up. You know, that's a lot of free money that's lying there. And actually, the empirical work that's been done suggests it's a much higher number in more highly protected areas of the country. And that would be the smaller provinces. So Atlantic Canada in particular, it's a double-digit income increase that is lying there in potential for us to reduce these barriers. But you would have seen the article in today's paper that says, well, you know, it looks like Nova Scotia is taking a big step on this reciprocity across provinces. But right away, they discovered that can't really work for labor mobility. So they're going to keep, you know, their kind of system for labor mobility. I hope that they're able then still to increase labor mobility. But that's what happens. And we also saw a week or so ago an article that there are 110 jobs in beer factories in St. John's, Newfoundland, that are at risk, because if we free up the trade barriers, beer in Newfoundland will come from, let's say, Montreal or perhaps Toronto, I don't know, or Halifax. It'll come from somewhere else. And so those 110 jobs are at risk. Well, if we got rid of all these barriers, so many more jobs would be created in those regions. But it always feels like a leap of faith to those whose jobs are at risk, right?
Yeah.
So that becomes the political inevitability. And I think if we have enough confidence that it will work, governments should be able to step up and say, if we could get 10% more income in Atlantic Canada, we're going to make out a lot more revenues as a government. So we can pay people up front to make these adjustments.
Bill, please.
Julian, you know, it's interesting when we talk about this. We talk about interprovincial trade barriers like they're you know, a monolithic issue, and Stephen knows this really well. And certainly when I was also the interprovincial trade minister for a period of time when I was in office, what becomes clear is it's actually many, many, many separate issues, ranging from labor mobility between provinces in the construction sector to pharmaceutical, you know, prescribing methods between provinces to trucking issues across provinces. And all of these things require a different mode for the governments to work together. It's not only what, it's how. There needs to be a sustained effort over time to getting down to these issues, because they will not be solved on day one. And so, you know, the nice thing, and Janet mentioned it, is, you know, what happened in the United States with the Sputnik moment way back when is, you know, you looked at that and you said, oh my gosh, we've got to do things differently. Exactly. We need to use this as an impetus for us to change the cadence of federal provincial meetings so that we can get at these things systematically, because this, as Stephen says, there's money to be found here. It's going to be hard to do it. And if we don't use this moment, we won't get it. So we need to move.
No, indeed. And we all remember COVID. And obviously that was, you know, a serious external existential threat initially that mobilized us to do things which we couldn't have done before. And so now we have a slightly different type of threat. Your point, I think, is well taken, which is to the extent that we can continue to mobilize around this crisis that the Trump administration has created, then we've actually got a chance. But it does come down to Mark Carney's as yet unproven skills as a political leader. And all of you have lived in the rough and tumble of politics in Canada for years. So you know better than I do how difficult that's going to be to actually work through. Janet, anything on that?
Well, I think we'll see with the cabinet tomorrow that the Prime Minister chooses, because hopefully it'll be a very, very competence-based cabinet, that he's got people there that have the skill sets that he's going to need to deal with all of these things. So that'll be an important test, and I think he will be judged on who he puts in cabinet. Not easy to do, but it's going to be a priority. The second thing I think he needs to do is focus on the entire decision-making process in the government. I mean, that has been one of the problems that's gotten in the way, even when people were well-intentioned on good things. I mean, they need to have a more efficient decision-making process. And if that means some new deputies around in the government, some fresh blood, then so be it. But I think that's really, really important. And then obviously the trade, stabilizing U.S. trade, Canada-U.S. trade, and then get started on our regulatory and tax reform. Because I think what's also important, not just what he does, but the symbols of what he does, because I think right now people need some early wins to show that change is actually possible. So even if it's something simple, like a couple of provinces do something or whatever, I think people need to see that there is possibility for change here, or we're going to lose the momentum that we've got.
Thanks.
And I think actually finally, a little bit of comment about fiscal stability would be nice.
Yes. So we'll come back to that before we're done. But one specific question that always arises here is not relying so much on exporting to the US. And I looked at the StatsCan data for March. I mean, you've all have seen that. Exports to the US were down 6 odd percent, but exports to other parts of the world were up by a similar dollar amount. I mean, is this a sign of things to come, or is that just a one-off blip? Steve, what's your thought on this? Because it does seem to me that we're talking about this as the solution, which it can't be that simple. Let's just export to other parts of the world.
No, it's definitely not that simple, Julian. And for sure, for the next little while, our data will be skewed by companies, doing little things to try and avoid tariffs at first. And there in the United States, there was a huge rise in inventories the first part of the year as companies brought stuff in to avoid being charged tariffs later. So this is going to make the data noisy. But the question really is, does diversification of trade, is that a key approach for us? Well, it's always been worth doing, but I think the perception that our trade is not diversified is quite wrong. The U.S. is still and will, I think, always be the largest, most dynamic economy on earth. And it has the same language, similar legal system, similar culture. And by the way, it's right next door. So Mother Nature, or if you like, the law of gravity, says we should be almost totally dependent on the U.S. for our trade. And yet we are not. 25% of our goods exports go somewhere else, some very large distances. And 50% of our services exports go somewhere else. This is a major accomplishment when Mother Nature, it's swimming upstream, that's a big thing. You got to remember that exporting it happens person to person, not country to country. You have to go out there every day and make a new sale. And if you're going to some exotic place, it's harder work than if you just go across the border to the US. So free trade agreements, we've got lots of them. They help enormously because they give you a supposedly predictable framework, as long as they're respected. And they generally have been until, I would say now, until the President of the United States has violated an agreement that he himself signed. But the other thing that we can do is, back in the Chrétien days, a really big thing was trade missions, where, the Prime Minister themselves and his group would take a bunch of business people somewhere, and you get to know some people, let's say in Korea. And that's how trade happens, person to person.
Good.
I think
Janet, and then let's get Janet and Bill in on this one.
I was just actually, Stephen makes a really good point, that the sort of the Team Canada approach that Chrétien took was actually very good. I can remember I was a cabinet minister in the Premier Mike Harris government. And I can remember Mike going on one of the tours. He was a little cynical about it, but felt he had to kind of be there. And I remember him coming back to cabinet saying, it was a good use of time. And I mean, I've worked with Toronto Global, with Invest Ontario, which are, agencies to attract investment in the province, in the GTA. And taking like a well-constructed trade mission helps those businesses, especially small to medium, get over the hurdle of I don't know anybody, or who do I call, or all of those things. It makes it about, I mean, it's not quite easy, but it certainly helps make it easier. And sometimes it's not, the big CEO that is the target for this. It can be somebody. I remember when I was elected at a business session, the Board of Trade session out here in good old Ajax, Ontario, and a guy standing up and talking about his company was the internationally best known company for some sort of little piece of nozzles in spray cans. And he was the global leader, and he had all these jobs and was selling around the world. So we need to help them, and government can play a big role in that.
Right. Thanks. Bill, what are your thoughts on diversification beyond the Americas?
Well, two frames that I think will be appreciated by many people that are listening in. First of all, I ran a business. We became the largest business in Canada in our sector. And then when we looked to expand, the most straightforward place that we could go to build our business was the United States. As Stephen said, the cultural advantage, the regulatory, the legal advantages, they are very significant. So I think we need to acknowledge that the need for us to have an agreement with the United States to continue to facilitate that is really important, because it was a whole lot easier to expand to the United States than it was to expand to Europe or to other places. So there is a reality of our continuing situation with the United States. Second thing, though, is we're going to need to think about things that we can do a little bit differently. Trade missions are a wonderful idea that's been used in the past. We are going to need to think about how do we do those in the new environment, because we have a different situation now. We have a whole lot of investors that might have been turned off from Canada because they're worried that we can't get things done as well or as quickly as we might like to do. So there will be a potential advantage for federal and provincial and Indigenous and business leaders all to go together to some investors around the world to say, here's what we're going to do differently to make projects accessible in Canada. Once you get that investment flywheel going, that helps for trade to be expanded. As you see investment go up, trade eventually follows. So we do need to think about increasing investment in the country and making sure that we listen to investors' real concerns that they've seen over the last long period of time, that it's tough to get stuff done in Canada. We're going to make it easier. That's going to allow them to come here, and that familiarity will increase, enabling trade with our trade agreements as a follow-on.
Got it. And just let me throw in one thought, which is, we're running a service business, which is called education. And the slightly baffling thing, except that you can all figure out what's going on, is we can't attract American students to Ivey. I mean, it's very difficult to get Americans to choose to do their education in Canada. It's much easier for us to get students coming from Asia. And as I say, you can all interpret that how you see fit, but it is one industry where actually doing business, with the US is strangely harder than Asia. I'm going to move us on to business investment and productivity, which is a huge bucket of discussion, if you like. And I'm going to start with what I know as an academic, and you guys can all comment on it, which is, we know that Canada, not exclusively, but Canada's growth in productivity, when you strip out just simply growth through adding new people, our productivity growth has sort of shrunk to zero. Essentially, the Canadian productivity is stuck. And it's been going downhill for certainly since the financial crisis of 2008, and arguably, if you take a 30, 40-year view, it's been going down, 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 down. So there's lots of reasons for that, and you will know them as well as I do. We're not investing enough in skills. We've got too much regulation. We're not good at adopting new technologies. Maybe there's an argument that it takes time for the new technologies to work their way through. What are your thoughts on, not just the general kind of academic question, but what are your thoughts on the levers we can use to start to improve productivity? This is a very old debate, but let's revisit it today. Janet, I'll go to you first.
I was afraid you were going to do that.
Yeah. Well, I saw you nodding vigorously.
No, I was agreeing with what you're saying.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a perennial problem. And I know Stephen and well, when Mark Carney was governor of the Bank of Canada, has opined for many, many years about the challenge of this. And I think actually in our earlier conversation when we were getting ready for this, I think, Stephen, you came up with the term super incentivize businesses to do this. And I think it's because it's trying to drive a bit of a cultural change too in I think our business leadership to start looking at the investment back into the business that you need to make instead of sending it off to shareholders or whatever it is you're doing it. I mean, that's important too, but I think there's a bit of a cultural issue here, and whether government can break it open with some good tax and regulatory strategy, I don't know, but it's certainly worth a try because we desperately need it.
Yep. Bill, what's your thoughts on that?
We've all spent time bemoaning this challenge. The way I see it is it's fundamentally an investment issue. If we look at the Canadian investment versus OECD countries, if you look at the Canadian investment versus the United States in R&D, in productivity enhancing investments in businesses, it is at about 60% of those two other, OECD or United States. So I think anybody who's in business would say that if I'm investing at 60% at the level of my competitors, that I'm not likely to be having better results. So I think we need to start with a fundamental issue. From the government standpoint, there are many levers that they need to think about. But the first thing I would say is you need to get a flywheel going. You need to start by having some confidence enhancing projects that get done. So I would be looking to what are the most likely projects across our country that are close to final investment decision, and what are the granular barriers to those actually happening? What are the things that are meaning that investors aren't moving forward? So you start there in order to try and get some investment potential. So that will be a critical first step. And I know that the Carney government is looking at that as a starting point. Then, of course, you're going to have some other things that you are going to need to think about, whether it be in the nature of investment opportunities in our country or in some of the barriers that we have. So let me start talking about the nature. We need to think about whether there are some things in our country that we can allow for people to create revenue creating opportunities. While I was in government, we thought about privatizing an airport or privatizing a major road. And why is that important? Because you allow investors to come into these projects and you start a flywheel going where people say, I'm going to invest in this country. And then in terms of barriers, the government's going to have to look closely at some of the identified barriers from, in particular, our natural resources sector to think about whether we can get some of those moving. We put in place a carbon price and an emissions cap. Are those two things redundant? That's a question we'll need to ask. We put in place an approach to dealing with putting big projects in through regulatory approval. We have to ask ourselves, are the approvals at the province and the federal level redundant? Are there timelines to make sure those approvals come more quickly? So there will need to be systematic approaches to considering how we change outcomes in investment as a starting point, because that's going to get at productivity over the longer run.
But of course, this is a 5-10 year project, right? I mean, these flywheels take a while to get moving.
It is, but the great thing about confidence is you can build it with one or two things that happen early on. So yes, to really get the flywheel spinning, it's a 5 and 10 year advantage. But if you can start it moving, then you start getting people creative juices flow about what they can do in order to make advances in their particular sector of the economy.
Steve, I know you've given a lot of thought to these issues.
And my colleagues are making all the great points. I agree completely with both Janet and Bill. And I think when it comes to productivity, it seems like there are so many things we can point to. I always feel like we end up boiling the ocean when it gets down to it. I'd like to focus on maybe a couple of pieces of low-hanging fruit that we could do like right now. One is Bill's alluded to barriers. I would call them processes. And I think one of the things we've done is we forgot that time is money. At least we forgot it in Ottawa, let's say. Time is money is productivity. If you spend 12 years getting the Trans Mountain pipeline done, well, that's 12 years of negative productivity in the statistics. Now we suddenly get some productivity out of it. Second thing, which is low hanging fruit, is crowding out. It's an economist term, but that is to say, government has grown. If we went back to, let's say, the last Harper budget, we had 13.5% baseline spending. 13.5% of the economy was baseline federal spending. Today, it is approximately 16.5%, 3 percentage points. And that is crowding out the private sector, which actually has to shrink as a share of the economy along the way. And that shows up as low investment and low productivity growth. Just to illustrate, we have 15% more jobs in Canada grown over the last 10 years, but 26% growth in public sector jobs and minus 4% in the resource sector jobs. So you've exchanged really high productivity jobs for jobs in which we can't even measure the productivity, and we don't as the public sector.
Yeah.
And third thing I want to mention is statistically, most of the productivity in an economy comes from the small company sector. It comes from companies that go from nothing through the hockey stick, and this growth happens out of thin air. It's not about the big companies. I think our big companies are actually doing a pretty good job on this. And so what we need to do is find better ways to finance the other 95% of small and medium-sized growth companies. 95% of those companies are declined credit here in Canada and seek it elsewhere. And we're doing a very poor job there.
And so there's always a paradox here, right? Government wants to step in and do things, but in many cases, we're actually saying they should be doing less. They should be getting out of the way. I mean, perhaps they need to do things to get out of the way. Broaden that point out into a question. Collaboration between business and government. Obviously, most of the people listening to this are Ivey grads, probably working in the private sector. They probably get pretty frustrated by the way that they are relating to government. Perhaps there's some exceptions. Any thoughts on what we can do to improve the relationship between business industry groupings and government? Who wants to go first on that? Steve, you are okay. Well, we'll go for Bill. We'll go to Bill first. What the hell?
There you go. Sure. Well, first of all, I think there's actions that need to be taken on both government side and on business side. When there's a problem, there's always more than one thing that we need to look at. From the government standpoint, I think what you've seen over the last government is a very active government. And just to pick up on what Stephen said in terms of time is money in government too. And if you spend your time on many, many issues, then you don't necessarily get at the important issues. There have been many, many discussions, federal, provincial discussions over the last 5 years that are crowding the agenda, which means that you're not getting to the discussions on how can we work together on enhancing our economy. So you do need to constrain the number of issues that you're trying to solve for and put growth and productivity at the top. That's your lens you need to think about. From a business's standpoint, what my advice to businesses is always is that when you're asking government to do something, don't just say, here's what I need, but say, here's what I will do if this changes. So if this particular issue, regulatory approach, whatever it is, law is changed, then we will make this sort of investment, which will lead to this kind of outcome. So there needs to be a mutual discussion of this. And what I always say is that business doesn't speak government and government doesn't speak business. The way that you get at that is when you're in business, go very granular, explain very carefully to government what it is that you're actually going to do and what the actual on the ground impediment is. And that's very helpful for government. They need to explain to business, look, I'm thinking about 100% of constituents, not just the constituents in your sector. And so these factors are important. That sometimes helps business to think through what they need to do in order to address those broader concerns from their lens. So dialogue's really critical. I have a sense, starting with Mark Carney last week, going down to the Business Council of Canada's meetings in Washington and speaking to the CEOs, that we will have some more openness to working together, business and government. And that will be refreshing. And I think gives me hope that we'll be able to have a dialogue that will produce better outcomes.
Got it. Janet, did you want to weigh in
Yeah,
on this
no,
one?
Bill made some really, really excellent points. And I was going to say, listen, I mean, like both sides listen. And Bill gave a good framework for how you should, because frequently the conversation is a little bit one-sided about, you know, the business leader comes in and here's what I want. And the politician sitting there saying, well, here's all the things I have to balance. So how are you going to help me do that? And vice versa. So it's a complicated conversation, but it's a conversation that really needs to happen, and they really need to listen each other. But the second thing is, I think the government needs to be very clear on its priorities too, because that I think helps focus the discussions, and that's not easy to do in a political environment where everybody's got their favorite pet project. And I can remember many years ago, I was actually sitting at a head table next to Prime Minister Harper, and I had particular issue. I was like, oh, cool, I'm going to lobby him on this issue.
Right.
And, you know, so I did, you know, was very respectful and very polite. And he sort of said, oh, thank you, Janet. But no, he said, I'm not going to do that. That's not on my priority list. And there was and I can remember sort of sitting there like it was like shock, because usually what you would get, someone, oh, gee, that's really, really important. Send my staff a letter, da, 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 da. And it was a legitimate decision he was making, but it was just like, no, it's not my priority. Here's what I'm trying to do. Bum, 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 bum.
Yep.
And that's, I think, important for government, because you can't do it all. And if you try to do it all, you're just going to get lost in the mess, if you can put it that way. So clear focus on priorities and consistency on them, right? Like, if you're going to do something, do it. If you're going to take a policy position, stick with it. And I think the Prime Minister there's a couple of issues he needs to clarify for folks about what is or is not going to be his position.
Yep. No, I mean, this is fundamental good advice for any leader, whether it's private sector or public sector. And we'll see how he gets on. Steve, you probably got a few additional thoughts on this point.
Well, I do. I think both Bill and Janet are making great points. And but I would observe that Prime Minister Carney has made one thing really clear, among others, but that he's here to do something as opposed to be something. I really like that as a catchphrase, and I think it's the hidden message there. It's an apolitical message.
Right.
It's like, I'm not here to please everybody. There's stuff we need to do, and some of that stuff is going to be hard, and frankly, wouldn't pass the usual political smell test, right? It would be the sort of thing that might get compromised into nothing. And so I think there is, and I think Bill's point is the most crucial. If business focuses on the outcomes that they're envisioning, government, and especially new government, will see the advantages of those outcomes as opposed to what do you need from me, right? So a big positive outcome is the sort of thing they can turn into a sale politically. Right. I think that's the key. That's the part of the press release that never gets paid much attention or enough time, let's say. And finally, tariffs. In the sense that tariffs are an opportunity. Like we all know, in the end, we're going to end up with U.S. tariffs all around the world. I don't know if we're going to get away with it here in Canada. I kind of doubt it. The point is, every other country is going to have some tariffs too. That's kind of the way we're headed. And that means a whole new source of government revenue, which in the past was big back before the war, Second World War. Today, it's very, very minor. It's going to be bigger now. And that kind of gives us an opportunity to have a kind of a mini tax reform, because that revenue could be fairly large. And then we could reduce taxes on businesses and also income taxes. And these would be the kinds of distorting taxes that you're basically replacing with what amounts to a sales tax, which I think is actually and a little sliver of genius, if you like.
Look out, you're making the president's case for him. You know?
I know. I said a little sliver of genius. I wasn't kidding. Okay. But,
so actually,
there is something in it that economists kind of gloms onto, that those kinds of taxes are better. You know what they are, and that's it.
So there's a nice segue there to what I was thinking was going to be our next discussion anyway, which is around fiscal sustainability. So this is a quote from Carney: "It's time to unite this country and invest in nation-building infrastructure on a scale not seen in generations," which obviously means, spending a bit more money. So I'd like your thoughts on how high we can go. You will all know these numbers better than I do, but I'm told that Canada's debt stands at about $1.3 trillion. I think that must be federal debt. Is that so? Perhaps we'll go to Bill first, because obviously this was your job. Perhaps it was Steve's job as well. But give us just remind the listeners, the audience, what is the debt to GDP level of Canada compared to other countries? How high can we push this before we start getting into kind of dangerous situations in terms of people who are buying into Canadian debt?
Well, this is a really important issue. It's also really important to put context around this issue. When we're thinking about the Canadian challenge right now, we have a tendency to feel like, the sky is falling, because it's true that our productivity has not been what we wanted over the last few years. But if anyone was going out to buy a business, and one business had a 42% debt to GDP, or in the case of, a business, if they had a certain amount of debt, and the other business had a 100% debt to GDP, and in that case of a business, a much more significant debt, you would think that you have a better starting point in the former than the latter. That's the difference between Canada and the United States. So 42% versus 100%. If you had a business that was, 1.5% of spending versus its overall scale of its economy, like in Canada, 1.5% of deficit to GDP, you're in a lot better place than the United States with a 7% deficit to GDP. That is not to argue that we're in the place we want on a debt front or on a deficit front, but it's to say our situation is much, much better than the United States, and also much better than the United Kingdom or France. Right. So it means that as we think about what we can do, we do have more potential levers at our disposal. So I'm not arguing that we should be cavalier. I think we have to be prudent around our fiscal management and think about how we can live within a constrained environment. And I think we need to protect our debt to GDP so that, like in COVID, we had the opportunity to spend so people could have, groceries and rent when they were off work. We need that capacity. But I think what the Prime Minister is saying is that in a time of precariousness, like what we're going through in the United States, we will need to think about how we invest to make sure that we make, as I was saying earlier, that flywheel start. So I'm expecting that what he's going to do is try to do that. Think about those places where we can make investments in infrastructure, whether it be in electricity grids or in transportation or telecommunications, that will enhance our long-term productivity.
So there is scope for, if the Prime Minister wants to spend a few $100 billion extra on infrastructure type projects, and the international debt markets won't get nervous.
Well, those were your words, Julian, not mine. So I'm glad they didn't come out of my mouth. I do think that when you think about international debt markets, we saw a little hiccup in the United States a couple of weeks ago at Liberation Day. So even the world's reserve currency, the United States, has confidence issues that it always needs to think about. So we do not have a reserve currency in Canada. We always need to remember that element of caution. But we are in a moment where we want to make sure that we get at this growth challenge, and that we do, while, as Stephen said, it's hard to pivot from the United States, we do need to help to consider other opportunities to grow our economy. So I'll be watching how they manage those two challenges at the same time.
And I was living in the UK when Prime Minister Liz Truss blew up the entire economy by not following fiscal rules, if you want to call it that. Responses on this, Steve, we'll go to you next. On fiscal stability.
Yeah, I agree completely on that. I would just remind everybody we've been in much worse places before, not just we're in a bill reminding us that we're doing better than others, but not as well as we maybe should. But back in 1994, which is, it's 30 years ago now, but it's still very memorable, at least for me. We had a 68% debt to GDP ratio, and we're spending hordes of money just to service that debt. We had a true crisis at that point. And I remember talking during the pandemic, even the worst case scenario that we could imagine, which was horrific, would only take us to a point far less than what we had experienced in 1994. So it kind of gave us a sense that we know, at least historically speaking, this is manageable. But I think the biggest thing here is distinguishing between government consumption, if you like, giving money to people, versus government true investment. Investment, like any company makes an investment, they expect it to pay off for 50 years. That's what we're talking about in infrastructure. And Prime Minister Carney has used the word very frequently in the last 2 weeks, catalyze. I do think there are lots of models that he could adopt, which will make our investment environment look more attractive and bring in more private capital from all sorts of institutional investors. And that means you get a multiplier on the things that really matter. You just have to design it so they make a decent return on it. And then they're not jumping through hoops for 5 years or 10 years to get the job done. So I think there is scope here for us to make a difference over the next couple of years without meaningfully adding to our debt load.
That's right.
And at the margin, it's okay if the debt load goes up, but we got to pay close attention, as Bill said. In other words, we need to be choosy, right?
Yep.
We need
I
to
get
make
that.
very selective kind of moves in this
Janet?
environment.
Yeah, I think there's two other things that go along with that. I mean, because it's just so easy in government to spend, right? I mean, government spends more overnight, just sleeping government spends more. So you need to sort of figure out one of the big things is your fiscal targets, your guideposts, what are you trying to achieve? What's your glide path to a more manageable debt load, et cetera. I mean, those things, like setting them and meeting them, because I think for business, we were talking about, giving business leaders certainty. And one of the things that I think helps do that is when a government can say, okay, this is going to be our target for debt to GDP, or this is going to be the deficit or whatever, and then try to actually hit those targets, because that provides a bit of certainty that I think helps investors make decisions. And the second test, of course, is what is that money being spent on? Expanding trade infrastructure or more civil servants, God bless them. And so I think that's an important test for the new government in terms of how people are going to judge what the Prime Minister is trying to do.
Got it. I want to move to immigration and talent attraction as a last block. But before I do it, there's a question from the audience. What unconventional levers need to be pulled for this unprecedented challenge? Unconventional levers. In other words, we have been talking about all the usual levers. Any kind of crazy ideas you'd like to throw into the mix on this?
Who did you go to, Julian? Sorry.
I didn't go to. I was just waiting. Bill, we'll go to you first. I think all three of you were trying to speak. Actually, did you?
Well, I guess it's always a question: what's unconventional and what's conventional?
Right.
The way I would take that question is, what should we be doing that we're not doing now?
Right.
And
right.
That to me is the challenge. You cannot expect different outcomes if you keep doing things the same way. So if we want more investment in our country, we do need to think about how we increase the opportunity for investors to make money. That means we are going to need to think about how investors get revenue from projects. And if we're thinking about big projects, we need to acknowledge that those big projects can create revenue, whether it's electricity grids or telecommunication lines or transportation links. So we need to be able to ask ourselves as a society, are we willing to be grown up and say, yes, investors need to earn returns against these things and not change our mind down the road. So I think to me, that is thinking about revenue generating models. It is tough to get these through the political sphere. I'm hoping, as I called it earlier, the Sputnik moment means people will rethink things that are possible and come up with agreements that can make them possible for the longer term. That's where I would go as a starting point. And then, of course, there'll be 100 other ways to answer that question. It's the right question, though.
Yep. Janet?
Yeah, I hesitate to say this because it shouldn't be unconventional, but I touched on it earlier. The ability of the government to say yes to this and no to that. I'm going to do these 5 things. I'm sorry, I can't do those 5 things, and I think that is unconventional these days and I think needs to be done. And the other unconventional thing is I think we should get Trump to keep attacking us. That's one of the things that's keeping Canadians motivated. I mean, so, hey, go at it, Trump.
Yeah, exactly. Steve, what are your thoughts on unconventional strategies?
Quick unconventional tools would be maybe, in effect, pay the provinces up front to facilitate eliminating those interprovincial barriers we talked before. don't make them make the leap of faith to the benefits. You just increase transfers and say that is being released on condition that you get rid of these 7 interprovincial barriers. And that'll give them a stronger incentive, perhaps, and they'll be able to compensate people who may be temporarily hurt along the way. Second one would be to make a massive public investment in carbon capture all by ourselves, thereby buying a social license, global social license, for us to expand today our conventional energy sector and supply the world, because we know we gotta get somewhere by 2050, but we know we need energy between now and then. And I think, right now the social license is in question, right? Can we actually expand in that sector? We haven't since 2015.
Got it. Briefly on immigration, I mean, I'm a foreigner. I'm happy to have the right to work in Canada. You won't be surprised to know that I think bringing more people into Canada, in a structured way, is a good thing. But obviously, I understand the political pressures. It's not just Canada; it's every developed country in the world is struggling with getting the right balance on this. Bill, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Well, my thoughts are, for anybody who's heard me over the years, very well communicated. I'm a strong supporter of having an immigration system that adds value to the economy. So I think that we've seen over generations in Canada the advantage of immigration that has added to our skills and talents in our country and helped us to grow our economy. Now, we need to look at why are we questioning this, period? We've had a bipartisan agreement for generations. We're questioning this because we had a series of policy mistakes over the last few years. Coming out of the pandemic, the government made some mistakes in terms of and governments, not only the federal government, but provincial governments, in terms of allowing more temporary foreign workers and more international students than we could absorb in a very short time period. So that has led to people scapegoating immigrants for a whole host of things that are broader issues that we need to deal with. Housing prices, access to healthcare, congestion on our roads. These are real issues. So what do we need to do? We need to get at these things because they're fundamental things to our quality of life. And at the same time, think about how we pivot our immigration system to what we know is necessary. An immigration system that has a points approach that says we're going to bring people, whether they're talented tradespeople or, technologists that are going to advance our possibilities in AI and quantum computing, that can actually help us to move forward faster and better. We need to do that, and that will be something that will help us to fuel the future. So it's not immigration at all costs. It's immigration that's clearly targeted, but we can absorb people, and we can do that as long as we're willing to deal with those quality of life issues in a way that addresses the very real concerns people have, that we don't have adequate services for the people that are here. So you're going to have to do more than one thing at the same time, but immigration is absolutely part of the future of our country. And it's something that, done right, we've proved is an advantage for Canada versus other countries.
Yep. And by the way, it's an advantage for Ivey and for Western as well. I mean, the more we have a good mix of international students, the happier I'll be. Couple of brief comments on that, and then I'll go to a closing question about finishing optimistically. Steve, your thoughts on immigration, and then Janet?
Well, very briefly, Julian, I just think, things the government can do. One they could do is make an actual concrete effort to invest and build quickly new student housing in the cities where stress is the highest. And then just allow the universities to go about their business of inviting foreign students to Canada. It's a really good immigration channel, and it's one we've arbitrarily kind of shut down and damaged our brand at a time when we can ill afford to do that, since education is one of our best exports. So I think that was a bad policy move right there. And we could fix that pretty quickly by making a clear investment in critical areas. Student housing. Student housing is not that expensive to build.
Indeed. Janet?
Yeah, and actually, I know a potential P3 partnership looking at a student housing project. I'll have to give you a call, Stephen. We need an immigration system that is needs-based. I think Bill touched on that. But it's also not only in the reality. but in the perception, because one of the things that I think troubles so many very, very deeply is that Canada was one of the few countries that would see, you could walk up to Mr. and Mrs. Front Porch and they'd say, yeah, immigration's a good thing for the country. That's not what a lot of people are saying, including recent immigrants. So that perception and public support for the policy has to be brought back. And I think a needs-based policy, consistency, would be really helpful. And also just because there's been a bit of whack-a-mole, gee, somebody said politically temporary foreign workers were a problem. Oh, well, okay, we'll cut that. And yet, what did we need in temporary foreign workers, right? And so there's been a bit of whack-a-mole, and when a political issue pops up, and I think a more consistent, logical policy would be helpful. And what we can accept, I got to tell you, as a Canadian, the stories of recent, whether I'm not refugees, immigrants, whatever, like we're literally sleeping on the street outside the immigration office because there was no place else for them to go. And I mean, what an awful thing to say about Canada's immigration system. So we really need to get that fixed.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time. We're going to finish on an upbeat note. What message or recommendation would each of you like to give to our audience? And if you want to direct your message to Mark Carney directly, you can do that as well. Who wants to go first? Steve?
Okay, sure. Well, look, I would just remind everybody that we're just starting the fourth industrial revolution. We only got 3 in the past. Here's the fourth. It's a huge opportunity, and that's where all the bright stuff happens. The last thing we can afford is let it go by us without participating. And I'm confident that we will if we don't stand in the way of Mother Nature like we tend to as Canadians. So I think we can't be afraid to super incentivize companies in facilitating that industrial revolution. Right now, we're having a run of bad luck, but anybody who's read history knows that on average, good luck outweighs bad luck. After all, that's how we got here.
Exactly. And Canadians amongst the most educated country in the world and attractive to a lot of overseas people. So let's capitalize on these things. Janet, and then I'll go to Bill.
Well, I think 2 things. One, I think we as citizens need to give the federal government a bit of space now, just to see what they are going to do. There's been obviously lots of talk, lots of good talk. So a little bit of space to see, are they walking the talk that they have said they would, and what they need to do, I think is really, really important. And all I can say is I really hope the Prime Minister meets the expectations that have been foisted upon him, rightly or wrongly. It's going to be a tough challenge, and he can't afford to the country can't afford the government to take a bad step, because we really do have a lot of work to do.
Exactly. Bill, last word.
Well, you asked for messages to the business community and messages to the government. To the business community, I would just say that while things often look difficult, we as Canada have great human resources, we have great natural resources, and we have the opportunity to really lead the world in many, many sectors. So I think we owe ourselves some sense of optimism in the future. Investment doesn't happen without optimism. And as Janet has said, using this moment, using what looks like an unfortunate thing happening in the South, perhaps that's the moment that we can actually say we can realize those opportunities and be optimistic. That's going to be necessary for us to be successful. To the federal government, what I would say is we cannot in any part of the country do it alone. There's only way to move forward in Canada because of the complications of our federal, provincial, municipal reality and reconciling with Indigenous peoples is we need to come at this business, government, provinces, municipalities, Indigenous. So we need to think about how we move at a pace that is fast and bring everyone along, because we need to use this moment to our best advantage. And collectively, we can do much better if we think about bringing all those voices together.
Thank you. Good. That concludes today's Ivey Impact Live session, Beyond the Ballot, from Promises to Policy. I hope you found today's conversation insightful and thought-provoking. One thing is clear: economic success in this new era will demand more than bold promises. It will require clarity of policy, collaboration across sectors, and the courage to act on difficult trade-offs. As we've heard, forging a stronger economy is not just a matter of politics, it's a matter of shared leadership. A big thank you to our panelists, Stephen Poloz, Janet Ecker, and Bill Morneau, for their time and their wisdom today. A recording of this session will be shared with all registrants. Please keep an eye on your inbox For more insights from Ivey on key business and policy issues, visit ivyimpact.ca. As you leave the session, you'll be prompted to complete a short survey. We'd really appreciate if you could take a moment to share your feedback. Thanks again, and have a great day.